Ulysses S. Grant is not even his real name, at least not his legal name. That just seems like a very important place. His actual name was.
That's so stupid.
I know. We're pretty stupid on this show. His actual name was Hiram Ulysses Grant.
What?
Yeah. His initials were Hug, which he hated as a kid. And went by the nickname Ulysses, his middle name. We'll get to why his name changed, but for just for heads up, the S means nothing.
Yeah.
But he was so he was born on 27 April 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. For those of you in the Buckeye State, you know where that is. For you not in the Buckeye State, south of Cincinnati.
You get another one, Pete.
Another Ohio president. Like I said, we got a theme here.
Yep.
We're the ones calling the shots, so we're picking the presidents close to home.
Yep.
So he was the son of a tanner, Jesse Grant, and a very religious housekeeper named Hannah Simpson Grant. Although there's some theories that the S stands for Simpson.
Oh yeah.
So he was a very okay student. His classmates nicknamed him Useless, but he was a very apt horseman, which will come into importance later on in the story. He did not want to be a tanner like his dad.
What's a tanner?
That involved people who make leather.
Oh yeah.
So I found out that Grant really hated the sight of blood, which is funny considering what he wound up doing for a living.
Ironic.
And he didn't like being around a bunch of slaughtered animals all day.
Yeah.
He would rather ride the horse rather than skin the horse.
I mean, that's good for the horse.
Well, yeah. Arguably, unless the horse was really ready to get off the merry-go-round.
There's that. Yeah, sometimes the horse is ready to die.
So this is an era before the GI Bill. So one way that you could get a free education was to attend West Point, which still is a very prestigious military academy. And Jesse Grant had reached out to his member of the House of Representatives to see if his son could get admission. And to the surprise of the family, he did get admission. Something that Ulysses was not very enthused about. But hell, it meant free college and it meant getting out of Ohio.
I mean,
there's a lot of things that don't change here over the military folks.
I get it.
So he attended West Point from 1839 to 1843. So he was a thoroughly okay student, but he was a very celebrated equestrian. But it is worth noting that he said, I'm going to paraphrase here, that the happiest days of my life were the day I left the presidency and the day I left the academy. But yeah, he graduated 21st out of his class of 39. And Grant had an attitude that a lot of us, if you're in the military, are familiar with, which is he was going to do 4 years in the military, resign, and then just get a real job. So because he was such a good horseman, he wanted to become a Cab Scout, but wound up getting attached to an infantry unit. He was assigned to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, outside of St. Louis, at the 4th Infantry Regiment. And at the time, Jefferson Barracks was the largest military base west of the Mississippi. By the way, there's like a pattern here. Like every place that he was stationed is like outside of like a big city. And I'm like, oh, was that just a thing in the 19th century?
It makes sense. Like, it
does, but now
that's where all the
military installations are outside of like, bumfuck nowhere.
Well, yeah, but like a lot of the military so at the time, like cities were logistic hubs for food distribution, right? Like if you've got 100,000 people, right, you got to feed them. And so that camp would just camp right outside those big giant cities. And then you could just say, oh, you should feed our 20,000 troops as well. And just like add 20% to the order. But now all of the bases in the South and the ones in Texas, right? Because the ones in the South were created as like part of the occupying armies after the Civil War. And the ones in Texas were kind of, if you kind of look at a map, the ones in Texas kind of form a line. There's 3 bases. There's Hood, Sam Houston, and Bliss. And they kind of form a line, a bit of a triangle, so that like if there was another attack from the Mexicans, like after the Mexican-American War, when when Texas declared independence, and then
Derwin, we haven't gotten to that part of the story yet. You're going to spoil it for everyone.
I just want to show everybody how smart I am.
All right. So, as all great decisions are made through typos. Ulysses S.
Hmm.
Grant's name confusion started out as someone just listing him as U.S. Grant. I know, very patriotic. He actually tried to correct that. It's like, my name's actually Hiram.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, no, no, no. I just imagine that S1 was about the same as it is now. So he probably submitted a 4187 and it just got lost.
Yeah.
He just stuck to Ulysses S. Grant. And the S stands for nothing.
Uh,
In West Point, they joked that it was Sam, as in Uncle Sam.
uh,
But it's just one of the great typos that changed history.
that's amazing.
Now we're going to start a segment on our show called Ladies First, in which that's ladies, comma, first, to explain why we aren't discussing them first, in which we're going to discuss our first ladies, because we have talked about some very interesting characters on our show.
Yeah.
And this week we will be discussing Julia Dent, who would go on to become Julia Dent Grant. She was the sister of Ulysses' roommate at West Point.
Oh.
So Frederick Dent introduced his West Point buddy to his sister Julia. By all accounts, Julia was a very intelligent and very artistic woman.
Quite the catch, that Julia.
She also was cross-eyed. Now, actually, one story that I can empathize with her on this. So her family was rich, and unfortunately, we have to talk about the fact that the elephant in the room. So why was her family rich? Well, they had a plantation in Missouri. This is harkening back to our Chest Story Arthur episode, in which his wife came from a family of Confederates. So she was on a rich Southern plantation which owned several slaves. That's going to become a theme on our show, I suspect.
Someone asked about our podcast, and then they said, "Oh, you're getting political," and I said, "No, about as political as we get is slavery was bad." And let's not be mean to people that are different than us, which I think is pretty safe to say.
We're also talking about a lot of dead people, so we're going to be a little like respectful.
Yeah.
To a point, unless they were like really bad.
Yeah.
But so her family was very rich and she could afford a surgery that would have fixed her eyes. But she ultimately said, "Is this going to change my vision at all?" And I was like, "No, I don't care then. Whatever." Just,
There you go.
And as someone who also has an eye deformity, one of my eyelids droops more than the other. I was also presented with hey, we could fix that with plastic surgery. And I said, "Does it change my vision at all?" "No." "Okay, then I don't care. I'll just keep it."
I just thought you were really tired all the time.
Well, I am, but I also have a droopy eye.
I've known you for years and I'm still learning new things.
That's what friendship's all about.
Yeah.
So Ulysses and Julia became quite smitten with each other right off the bat. And by all accounts, it was like a genuine like partnership. So they stayed together for, Ulysses S. Grant would go on to serve in the Mexican-American War, which you already alluded to. So yeah, the real quick bluff of that is that America annexed Texas and Mexico was not having it because that used to be part of their country. So he went off to fight in the war, but before that happened, they became engaged.
Sure.
And to stick with Julia a little bit, her family owned slaves, and Jesse Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's father, was an abolitionist. So out of protest, he did not attend that wedding.
That's complicated.
And in fact, 3 of the guests at the wedding, which happened after the Mexican-American War, would later fight against Grant during that whole Civil War.
That's even more complicated.
I know. 4th of July get-togethers are probably kind of awkward after that.
That would be like you and me fighting because you were at my wedding.
You know what? That's actually an apt comparison. So, let's just hope like the next couple Star Wars movies aren't too divisive. Otherwise, I mean, like it could get super awkward when we hang out.
True. Yeah.
But it is important to give some time to the Mexican-American War.
Sure.
It is one of the sort of forgotten wars, but we've actually talked about it on the show because the commanding general that Grant served under was Zachary Taylor.
Hey, the Zack Attack.
Zack Attack, indeed. I love that. So he, for those of you who did not listen to that episode, is the president who pooped himself to death, ate some bad cherries and some unpasteurized milk right after 4th of July weekend, too. That's just extra sad. Here's a detail I didn't mention when we recorded that episode. I'm apparently related to Zachary Taylor.
What?
I know. I'm related to like the home improvement president.
So, I mean, you are from Ohio, so...
Well, Zachary Taylor wasn't from Ohio. He's one of the few presidents we've talked about who's not from the Buckeye State.
Well, then now I'm confused.
Yeah, my dad just messaged me. He's like, you should talk about Zachary Taylor because you're related to him. Like what? I'm related to the slave owner who pooped himself to death. Could we have been related to a cooler president?
Yay.
Um, here's the thing. I think it ultimately comes down to all white people are kind of related, especially if they're from Northern Europe.
I mean,
Um,
if you go back far enough,
yeah, so it's not as cool or, in this case, interesting as it sounds. But to give some credit to General Zachary Taylor, he was a huge influence on Ulysses S. Grant, who, as I pointed out before, was not particularly hyped about the whole military thing, which is fitting because that's the biggest thing he's known for.
Yeah.
But under his command, Grant studied Taylor a lot and saw like understood the importance of tactics and strategies. So if you think Grant was a very good general, you need to thank Zachary Taylor, one of our super forgotten presidents. But even though America did prevail in 1848, Grant was opposed to the war and called the Civil War karma for the aggression towards Mexico because he thought it was an unfair advantage of a much more powerful country kicking the ass of a much less powerful country.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
But Grant still was cited for bravery twice, and it was overall a great experience for him growing as a soldier.
Yeah.
And then after the war, he went back to Missouri, got hitched with Julia Dent Grant, and then got stationed in Detroit, New York, the Oregon Territory, and California. When he moved out west, his family did not join him, and he did what any soldier does when they're away from their family, get really depressed and drink too much.
That sucks.
So here's where we get into the part where there's like a knowledge gap in history. So it is well documented that Grant had a problem with the bottle.
Sure.
But usually just when he was away from his family. So he did get in some trouble for showing up to work drunk, but I mean, who hasn't? And under unknown circumstances, resigned his commission in 1854.
Bummer.
Seems sad. He was drinking too much at his barracks room, so he wanted to get back home to his wife and kids.
I get it.
So, well, he moved back to Missouri to work on a hard scrabble farm, his words, that his father-in-law gave them. Now, we have the biggest elephant in the room to discuss. And by the way, we're talking about one of America's greatest heroes. We're going to say a lot of great things about this guy, but
people are complicated.
People are very complicated, especially in a very complicated time in history. So he worked on this farm, and he was also in poor health because everyone was in poor health back then. There's just so many diseases, and there was like no medical cures for anything. So to help out around the farm, he bought a slave.
Oh,
yeah,
that's not good.
I know, Grant. I mean, like, come on, dude. So he bought a slave from his father-in-law, and to give some dignity to the slave that he owned, that slave's name was William Jones. And to give a little bit of credit to Grant, he did eventually emancipate William Jones in 1859.
Okay.
And more to Grant's credit, Grant was a shit awful farmer.
Sure.
And completely tanked any savings he had for his family.
Well, that's not
so
good.
In 1859, the guy was broke. He could have made $1,000 by selling his slave, but instead gave the guy his freedom. So that's a little bit nicer.
Yeah.
Still owned a slave. Last president to own a slave. That's awkward.
It presents the three-dimensional version of him, right? It kind of shows the conflict that he was in because he was kind of torn between two different ideologies, two different thought processes, where like his dad was an abolitionist, but his father-in-law was a super pro-slavery guy. And so I get it. He's trying to ride a line, it sounds like.
Yeah, that seems to be, it says a lot about his character, because even like when he gets to Washington, there's a lot of like, what do I believe versus what is the customs of the time.
Yeah.
The guy is a soldier, so loyalty is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
But to get back to his pre-Civil War life, and so he tried several other ventures, and Grant was kind of bad at everything except for war and being a horseman. So the saddest little detail I found is that he moved to St. Louis to sell firewood.
Oh no.
I know. I like on this. I don't mean in a store. I mean like on the street. Like, hey, do you need firewood? And it's like, that is not what you want to picture, Ulysses S. Grant doing.
No.
So he got bailed out by his father. Unfortunately, the job was doing what he never wanted to do, which is be a tanner. It gets worse. He was a tanner in his little brother's shop in Galena, Illinois.
Oh, that's even worse.
Yeah, he had to get helped out by his little brother.
Oh no.
That's just sad. Doing the job that he went to West Point to avoid having to do.
He went to a place he didn't want to go to avoid doing a job he hated, and then he went back to the job. Oh fuck, man.
All right.
That sucks.
But it's about to get better in the saddest way.
Oh no.
The South seceded from the Union.
Yeah.
And civil war was declared. I mean, I just imagine a little part of Grant was like he got like like the governor recalled all inactive officers, and he was like, "Thank you God for the Civil War. It got me away from this damn tanning shop."
Maybe I'll just die.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, at least I don't have to go back to that damn tanning shop in Galena,
it's okay.
Illinois.
I'll get stabbed with a bayonet. It'll be fine.
Spoil a little bit of the story. He never had to become a tanner, so things worked out well. So he was reactivated as a commissioned officer, initially in the Illinois militia, but distinguished himself very quickly by providing discipline to a bunch of rough and tumble volunteers in the Union Army. And so they're like, you know what? We're going to promote this captain to a brigadier general because he's just that dang good at disciplining his soldiers.
Wow.
I suspect the army was kind of small back.
That's like a lot of steps in between captain and brigadier.
That's a lot of steps.
That's an 03 to like an 07, right? That's a 4-step jump.
Yeah, that's like a Starship Troopers kind of promotion right there.
Yeah. We're the old men now, Ace.
So he very quickly distinguished himself amongst the other generals because, as I read repeatedly, generals in the Union Army fought to not lose, whereas Grant fought to win. What does that actually mean? It means that Grant was willing to let a lot of Union soldiers die.
Ooh.
So he believed in higher stakes combat, and specifically he did so because that's how the Confederate generals would fight. They would send a wall after wall of soldiers to their certain death because it meant that a bunch of Union soldiers died.
So it's kind of like Ricky Bobby's mantra of if you're not first or last.
Well, actually, that's a very perfect comparison because we're gonna really abbreviate the Civil War, folks. By the way, just because we're a president's podcast, not a general's podcast. But if that is the mantra of Grant, it worked because guess what? The Union won the Civil War.
There you go.
Just one quick detail, because there is obviously a ton of fun details about the Civil War. It's one of the most documented events of the 19th century and probably American history. But when Lee went to sign the conditions of his surrender, Robert E. Lee got dressed up in his finest military regalia and made sure to make himself as presentable as possible as a Southern gentleman. Grant stayed in his muddy, stained field uniform.
It was the surrender at Appomattox, right? At the Appomattox courthouse?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it just, I think that just says something about Grant, who was just sort of like, I don't give a fuck. I won.
Well, yeah. And also, too, like, it was, I get Lee's perspective. Like, well, we just lost. So I'm just going to, like, I get it, right?
It sends the message of I was in combat, whereas you look like an out of touch officer. You know what? Again, Grant, like a boss.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's what he was going for. I think it's because from my understanding of generals of the time, it was like from what I'm understanding of General Washington, right, was like you would be presentable as an officer in combat, right? Like your men would look to you and say, oh, that guy, he's top to bottom, left to right, looks like a general. Like, because I remember when I got off active duty and I showed up and I had my beret on because we still wore berets back then every day.
I don't miss them.
Yeah. And like, I was like presentable and I had my best uniform and I looked really good. I had a fresh haircut when I was signing out because I'm like, oh, this is the last time that I'm going to be this person. And that was the last time that Lee was going to lead his troops as their general. So I imagine he was presenting himself as that general. And to piggyback off what you were saying about the surrender in Appomattox, Grant did something really smart, right? He let the Confederates maintain their dignity as soldiers, right? Because, he made sure that the Union troops, didn't denigrate them, didn't mock them. He said, you treat them as your fellow soldiers and countrymen, because if you're smart, you realize, oh, that's how you stop an insurgency from happening later on down the line, right? That's what we should have done in Iraq instead of disbanding the Iraqi army in '03. And Grant did it the smart way, right? And and then he fed them. He fed the rebel soldiers.
Yeah, I love that detail.
Yes, like he commissioned 25,000 rations for the rebel soldiers at Appomattox because they were starving. And so he fed them. And then he said, let them keep their horses, let them keep their weapons, and let them march out in formation, right? To maintain their dignity one last time. And to me, that speaks a lot to Grant's character. But please continue.
Oh, no, absolutely, dude. If you want to ever interject with details that I don't have on my little handy dandy notebook, please.
Yeah.
All right. So Civil War is over. And Grant becomes one of the most famous human beings in the country.
Sure.
So, what does one do? So for a while, he just acted as an advisor to, I forgot to mention Abraham Lincoln gets shot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty important.
Yeah.
And where did Abraham Lincoln get shot?
Ford Theater.
Ford Theater. You know who was supposed to be a guest at Ford? Who was supposed to go with them to see our American cousin?
Grant
with his wife. Now, according to sources I found, Grant was supposed to be the Lincoln's +2 on that double date, but Julia and Mary Todd Lincoln did not get along.
Well, that's
so they
fortunate.
made up an excuse that they wanted to go visit their kids in New Jersey.
That's fortunate for Grant that his wife did not like Mary Todd.
Yeah, especially since Grant was allegedly one of the targets of John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
So that could have been a very unfortunate double date.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, and we're veering way off topic here. Was it Mary Todd a little bit off?
Crazy?
Yeah, crazy.
I mean, not for nothing, but that is, by all accounts, Julia Dent was a very pleasant woman, a pleasant woman who came from a plantation, but still a very pleasant and intelligent woman who made friends easily.
Yeah.
Mary Todd Lincoln, who, just not only had she experienced a lot of really unfortunate things, but this was a time before we had, really revolutionized behavioral health treatment.
Sure.
So it was probably the treatment of the day. It's like, oh well, you're possessed by ghosts, so we're gonna bleed you.
We're gonna bleed you, give you cocaine, and then lock you in a sanitarium for 10 years. I mean,
Yeah.
and too, she was married to Abraham Lincoln, who I imagine a mediocre president's wife is stressed out, right? Imagine being the wife of the guy who's trying to keep the chaos from consuming the entire nation. That's nuts, right? So you got a lady who's already a little bit, I don't want to say crazy, but who has some mental health issues. And then her husband is probably stressed out. And so, yeah.
And if she was worried about her husband, it wasn't for nothing, because he did get shot in the head right in front of her.
That'll probably do it.
Plus, I really doubt Mary got to see the end of that play.
No. Was it a good play, you think?
Yeah, I don't know, because I think most theaters don't put it on anymore.
It's probably not good luck.
I just, out of, maybe a fear of, repeating history.
Yeah.
But we could talk about Ford Theater for a very long time, but we're going to get back to Grant, because we haven't even started getting into the whole him becoming president thing. After the Civil War, Grant stayed on to be a political advisor for Abraham Lincoln. Those two became pretty good friends, by the way. But then when Lincoln was assassinated, he stuck around to help out Lincoln's successor, which was Andrew Johnson, who, trust me, we will do an episode on Andrew Johnson, maybe next season.
Nice.
Now, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner and a former Democrat who was sympathetic towards the Confederacy, but to a fault. He believed in a very, very quick reunification and believed in order to gain the hearts and minds of their former enemies, we'll just skip that whole civil rights for the freed black men, whatever. Now, Grant, who had seen the sacrifices of the Civil War up close and personal, probably more than most, thought that was disrespectful to everything that they fought for, and he and Andrew Johnson butted heads. Andrew Johnson, if you know anything about him, you know he's the first president ever to be impeached
Oh,
and came within one vote of being kicked out of office. So Johnson was not popular, and it didn't help that he had been preceded by one of the most popular presidents to ever get assassinated. So the radical Republicans thought that Grant would be a proper successor to Johnson because he did have their same ideologies in regards to how we should treat the South. So in 1868, the radical Republicans put in his name. Grant was still one of the most popular human beings in the country. So it was kind of a landslide victory. And now we see what happens when you pick someone because they are popular, even if they have no experience working in government. It doesn't end well for anyone.
no.
So I've got a list of pros, cons, and in betweens because this guy's 8 years were complicated.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the pros.
Pros are good.
He readmitted all 7 states into the country in 1870.
Well, that's good.
Our boy Johnson was not in too much of a hurry, apparently, to reunite the country.
That's bad.
That is bad. He was a true military gentleman and met with General Lee in the White House to, patch things up.
Hey.
So that's, again, these are, even if they're on opposing sides, if you're a general, you tend to be a professional.
Lee was his peer in a lot of ways, right?
Like they both were at West Point.
They both went to West Point. He's trying to reunite the country. It makes sense, right? Like you take a symbol of the losing side and say, hey, it's okay. We're all, Americans again, right? Like I get it.
He signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act, which then made Yellowstone our first national park. So all of this is like all the good stuff kind of gets expanded upon by future good presidents, like, national parks. Somewhere Teddy Roosevelt was born when this law got signed into action. He pushed for the 15th Amendment, which would grant all men the right to vote.
Sure.
Speaking of the right to vote, he supported suffrage. So he did not live to see women getting to vote, but he was super duper not opposed to it.
That's good.
He established the Justice Department in 1870. I don't know what we did before there was a Justice Department, but that's cool. He sent troops to fight the KKK in the southern states.
I was thinking about that guy. I read about that yesterday, where he sent soldiers in to break the back of the Klan. Like that's huge. Like
that's 100% good.
Yeah, like those guys were like mostly old Confederate soldiers, right? Like that's the post-war insurgency right there that he crushed in his infancy.
Let's see. He pushed for civil service reform. If you listen to our Chester A. Arthur episode, you know that was his key action.
Yeah.
So it'd be a couple presidents until we actually saw the spoil system dismantled.
Sure.
Because again, if there's a reoccurring pattern on the show, the president may be the most powerful human being on earth, but they still have to answer to Congress and the Supreme Court.
Sure.
So yeah, he may have been like, the spoil system, which if you didn't listen to the episode, says you get a government job because of who you support rather than are you qualified for the job. He supported the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which obviously did not make everything perfect. He appointed the first Jewish governor of the Washington Territory.
That's progressive.
So at least he wasn't anti-Semitic.
There's
That's
that.
Good. And now we're going to get into the in-between. So you may have been thinking, or you probably haven't, what were Grant's thoughts on the indigenous population of America?
Yeah.
So this is definitely in the gray area.
Yeah.
So he believed, he was very progressive in the regards that he acknowledged that the indigenous population was here first.
Sure.
And while a lot of people, especially in the military, favored all-out genocide, he proposed the idea of putting the indigenous population in reservations.
It's better than genocide.
Well, now we recognize what Grant was proposing as cultural genocide because he was in favor of assimilating the native population into America. So it's like, well, we're going to cut your hair short, give you our clothes, teach you our history and all that kind of stuff. And you're just one of us now. No, again, there's grains of good in this bad of trying to remove their culture from existence.
Sure.
Now, something I just did not know until yesterday was that the indigenous population weren't even granted citizenship at the time. Despite the 14th Amendment saying if you're born in America, you are a citizen of the country, it wasn't until 1924 in which the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, which said if you are indigenous, you're still American. So that's weird.
1924?
1924.
That's less than 100 years ago.
Yeah, we're talking the Coolidge years.
Wow.
So that's an interesting bit of American history. Now, one interesting thing is that he appointed an indigenous commissioner to the Department of Indian Affairs, the first non-white person to have a cabinet position.
That's good.
And yeah, it was a former Civil War buddy of his, a general. Now we talk about the cabinet. We're going to switch right from the good, the in between, right to the bad. Now, at the time, there were 7 departments, and every president since then has gotten some sort of flack for how much of a turn of a right they have in their department heads. But in those 8 years and in those 7 departments, can you take a guess about how many department heads Grant had?
27.
Actually, it was 25.
There
was a huge turnover rate in his cabinet because Grant really had a bad judge of character. We're going to get into all the many controversies of the Grant administration because he was a very loyal person. Now, when he became president, the Republicans were like, great, we have so many recommendations on who you should have. And he was like, no, I want my friends. If you're starting to suspect this sounds a little like the Warren G. Harding administration, you're not wrong. Also from Ohio. So he got a bunch of his Civil War buddies together to fill up the cabinet positions, and then a few members of the legislative branch. But oh god, where to even start with this? Let's go with the whiskey ring.
Whiskey ring.
The whiskey ring, because it's the best name of all the many controversies he had. So in St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee, whiskey distillers, agents of the IRS, and the Treasury clerks conspired to siphon off liquor tax revenues into campaign coffers and individual pockets.
Well, that's not good.
Now, Grant himself may have overseen a wildly corrupt cabinet, but by all accounts, he was not involved. So Grant appointed his Treasury Secretary to look into it and appointed a special prosecutor to investigate. So good on him for investigating this whiskey ring. Then it was discovered that his personal secretary, General Orville Babcock, received expensive gifts from the people orchestrating the whiskey ring in order to look the other way.
Oh.
And there was also telegrams between, again, his personal secretary. So I'm guessing this is sort of a precursor to the chief of staff. There was telegrams between Babcock and the people orchestrating the whiskey ring that were written in code. Things did not look good for his personal secretary. It was also his good, war buddy. And Grant, the whole time, he is very loyal. And Babcock's one of his friends. So he was furious when the independent investigator discovered that his personal secretary was involved in this. So he did what any rational man would do, which is fire the special prosecutor and hire somebody else.
That doesn't look good.
Things do not look good for Grant, but he is a true friend and did speak at the trial that Babcock was on. And Babcock was ultimately acquitted, but he did wind up resigning because of the whole, shame and disgrace thing.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we've talked about how behind every great man is a great woman, and behind every great president, there's a vice president. So Grant had as his first vice president, Schuyler Colfax, who is one of only 2 people to have been the Speaker of the House and the vice president. Right after the election of 1868, there was another scandal that broke, the Credit Mobilier scandal. So one of the good things that Grant oversaw in his tenure was the building of the Transcontinental Railway, which was from Sacramento to Omaha. So not quite transcontinental, you know what I mean? Still real big.
Yeah, it's a big railroad.
So it was discovered that politicians had been taking bribes in favor of getting Union Pacific the contract for the Transcontinental Railroad. One of those politicians was then Representative Schuyler Colfax. So even though Schuyler Colfax was never convicted of taking bribes, he was still accused. So Grant did the right thing and got him removed and replaced him with another politician, Henry Wilson, who was also then tied to the Credit Mobilier scandal for taking bribes. So at the very end, he just had no vice president.
You know, that's probably for the best. Like, there's a
Fool me
Speaker of the
once.
House. Like, the chain of succession goes president, vice president, Speaker of the House. Like, we can just skip that middle step. It's fine.
And he's not the only president we've ever had who just said, you know what, I just don't need a vice president. I feel like I'm getting burned too much here. So it's fortunate that Grant didn't get assassinated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in total, of those 25 members of his cabinet, his attorney general, his secretary of war, his secretary of the navy, and his secretary of the interior were also accused of taking bribes.
Good Lord.
Yeah. It's like a much more thorough version of the Harding scandals, because those at least didn't really emerge until after Harding was dead, and Grant had to live with this.
Oh, man.
And all throughout, I mean, Grant, to sort of maintain, like, he was by all accounts innocent. He was just loyal to a fault.
Sure.
As a friend.
I get it.
So he opposed the spoils system, but appointed his brother-in-law the collector of the port of New Orleans. That's like, dude, you can't have your cake and eat it too here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I get it. I'm married.
Happy spouse, happy White House.
I get it. Yeah, exactly. There you go. Happy spouse, happy White House.
So yeah, this is getting too sad. So we're gonna move on to something even sadder. Grant's post-president's life. So after 8 miserable years as president, in which so much of his goodwill is getting flushed down the outhouse
into the night soil.
Exactly. Thankfully, he did not drink any of the midnight soil. Otherwise, he would have ended up like his old boss, Zachary Taylor.
Exactly.
So he and Julia decided, fuck this noise. Let's leave Washington. We're going to go on a 2-year international tour. So they went all around the world, getting heroes welcomes everywhere they went. And they got to see the country. Basically, I love the post-president's vacations. Like Teddy Roosevelt was like, I'm going to go to Africa for a year. So all throughout this world tour, the Grants slowly lose money because it's very expensive to go around the world, especially before airplanes existed.
Sure.
So they came back to America pretty broke, but they still had a little bit of goodwill. So Grant did what any father would do, which is he invested in his son's up and coming business.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. And Grant's son's business partner was creating a Ponzi scheme.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. And wound up taking the last of the Grant's money. And it's just like, oh, dude, you're so bad at everything except for being a general. So he was flat broke, and it gets worse.
Oh, no.
He went to the doctor and discovered he had throat cancer.
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah. And this is well before like advancements and medical breakthroughs like chemotherapy. So, I mean, this is like, cancer still is pretty much a really awful thing. But this was like, you have cancer. What does that mean? You're going to die.
Yeah.
So he's broke, he has cancer, and he has a family that he wants to look out for.
Exactly.
And Grant had 2 really great things going for him. One, he became friends with an up-and-coming author named Mark Twain.
That's so cool.
And 2, Grant, again, may have been kind of bad at everything else, was actually a really good writer. One of the little things he discovered, because people said, hey, would you mind writing a few articles about your time as a general? Oh, okay, cool. And made a little bit of money off of it. So Grant was eventually persuaded to write memoirs. So when Mark Twain found out about this, he was like, oh, that's cool. I'm also kind of a writer too. You may have read Tom Sawyer, kind of a big deal. So Twain said, can I take a look at this contract, and realized that he would only get 10% of the royalties. And I love the fact that we're hosting this show together. Because for those of you who don't know, we're both authors, but Derwin is my publisher. Yeah. So I just imagined if I saw the contract said you get 10% of the money. It's like,
oh yeah, no, that's no, everything's 50-50.
But Grant was so loyal. He's like, yeah, it's kind of a crappy deal, but I also said I'd work with them first. And so Mark Twain was like, okay, for the first time in your life, can you just be kind of like a dick to somebody and just renege on this contract that you haven't even signed yet, and let me publish the book. So Mark Twain, he's his friend. He's like, I will give you a much better deal. So in the last months of Grant's life, he wrote out his personal memoirs. This is an era before every president wrote a book. Bill Clinton writes books with James Patterson now. So this is a different time. So Grant wrote out his personal memoirs. At first, he was dictating them. And then once he lost the ability to speak, he would just pencil to paper them. And throughout this, Mark Twain is cobbling it together, making it into a book. And then a few months after he finally finished writing these memoirs, Grant died. And on 23 July 1885 in Mount McGregor, New York. His family's still penniless.
They were talking about Grant at the end when the throat cancer was getting so bad. It looked like he had like a golf ball or something sticking out of his neck. And so swallowing water and food and stuff was just so painful for him that he would go as long as he could without drinking water or eating food so he could just dictate the memoirs and just keep talking, because he would be in so much pain he'd have to start taking a lot of opioids and just to kind of get through eating lunch. And so it's really, the guy is just a
really unfortunate end. Kids, don't smoke cigars.
Don't
smoke.
He's a guy that just got by on sheer perseverance. Like some people achieve notoriety and greatness just because they keep trying long enough, right? It's the William Shatner effect, like he's not.
You're the only person in history to compare Grant to Shatner, and I love it.
I feel like he's the William Shatner of like politicians and generals, because he just kept pushing through and trying, and then he's on our money, right? William Shatner has Emmys, and because he just kept going for decade after decade. But anyway, please continue.
Someday they'll find me talented.
Please continue. Penniless and sad.
All right. So I'm going to end Grant's story on a very happy note. Thankfully, a very happy note. Like, this guy had like two victories in his life, the Civil War and his book. So the book gets published by Mark Twain and becomes a huge critical and commercial success. It's available on iTunes, by the way, in case you want to listen to it. It is very long, and it is noteworthy in that it gets into great detail about everything about his life, except for his time as president.
I mean,
probably for the same reason why we spent about 25 minutes deep diving his presidency. It's just like, you know what? Let's just leave that one on the cutting room floor.
People talk about Michael Jordan, the Bulls, not the Washington Generals.
Yeah. We've compared him to Tom Brady and Michael Jordan and William Shatner. This is a fun show.
I mean, he's a complicated man.
Yes, he was. So that caps up the life of Ulysses S. Grant, our 18th president. So now we get to the question. The first question: do you think Ulysses S. Grant deserves more credit for his time as president?
Only with the aspect where he busted up the Klan, right? Because you and I, as veterans of the global war on terror, and you were in Afghanistan, I was Iraq, but we kind of saw what I saw a little teeny tiny bit, right? I didn't see anything crazy, but our generation of soldiers saw what a counterinsurgency fight was like, right? And so the Klan, who were made up of Confederate veterans, could have easily turned into that. And then he crushed it, right? To where they didn't spend the next 50 years fighting the Klan, like we did in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So yes, for that aspect there.
Yeah, I think he's kind of earned his reputation as being on the lower end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
No, the thing is, it was not for lack of good morals.
Yeah.
The guy clearly had a good moral compass. But when he was president, it seems like all of that, courage he had as a general just wasn't there. Like, he wasn't willing to stand up to his cabinet. He wasn't willing to stand up to Congress.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say he probably deserves to be remembered as a general and a really prolific author of, one best-selling book.
Because his memoirs are mandatory reading at West Point.
That is appropriate, especially considering how much he hated West Point. Now, on to the next important question. In honor of Warren G. Harding nicknaming his penis Jerry, what do you think Ulysses S. Grant would have nicknamed his penis?
Ulysses S. Penis.
That is very insightful.
I didn't really have anything good. That's all I could think
thought
of.
long and hard about this one. Long
Eh.
and hard. Hi, Mom and Dad, for listening.
Thank you for subscribing.
The guy was from a very nice part of Ohio. And so I think he would have, as a homeboy, would have appreciated nicknaming his penis after where he came from, because he came from a part of Ohio called Point Pleasant.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think he would have nicknamed his penis as a kid. Like, I'm going to call my dick Point Pleasant.
The Pleasant Point.
The Pleasant Point. The West Point Pleasant.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yours is better than mine. You put thought into yours. Would you want Grant to be a member of your zombie survival team?
Yes, 100% yes. The guy was really bad at everything except for being a general. So, yeah, I want him on my side during the zombie wars.
Oh, agreed. You got to lean into like, if you're going to pick a squad, you got to lean into their strengths, right? Like if you got a president who's good at like farming, maybe put him in the background. Be like, you're going to take care of the garden.
Yeah, this is like the third president in a row in which we've just unequivocally said yes.
Yeah. I mean, he's no Herbert Hoover, but you know,
we need a non-combat experienced president to discuss next, just so we can break things up and be like, instead of just, yes, this guy killed 1 million people in war. yeah. I want him on my side.
Yeah. Anyway, Pete, you got anything else for us?
Actually, I do have a very important question. This is specific just to this episode. Now, for those of you who don't know, Derwin has been to Grant's tomb.
Yes.
In New York City. So I have to ask, who is buried in Grant's tomb?
Ulysses S. Grant?
Nobody.
What?
Nobody is buried in Grant's tomb because it's a mausoleum.
In my defense.
Therefore, they're not buried. Their graves are above ground.
Oh, well, okay. So I didn't actually go inside, but this was like 2 weeks after they lifted COVID restrictions in June of 2021. So like, you know, like you weren't going inside anywhere, like hardly most places. Like you couldn't go to the New York Public Library when I was there. So there's a picture going to be on this episode and some more pictures that we took outside. So that's cool. But yeah, I couldn't go in. I wanted to. I would have taken more pictures.
All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Dead President Society. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to providing you with more random trivia about our forgotten and forgettable presidents of the United States. Derwin, do you have any closing thoughts?
No.
All right. Thank you very much. And that's the way the tombstone crumbles.
And yes, that.
Have a good day.